el Conversatorio Respuestas de la sociedad civil y las administraciones ante el discurso de odio. Damos comienzo al conversatorio Respuestas de la sociedad civil y las administraciones ante el discurso de odio.
Bueno, pues entiendo que esto es el pistoletazo de salida al conversatorio en el que estamos todas, todos y todes convocados. Os doy la bienvenida a este conversatorio y quizá el primer paso para poder iniciarlo es conocer a quienes van a formar parte de esta conversación, que nos gustaría poder ampliarla a todo el público y poder tener, pues, al final del mismo, un intercambio de impresiones, opiniones y de respuestas a lo que nos vengan planteando. Por ese motivo voy a ser muy estricta con los tiempos. Sé que somos muchas las personas que estamos aquí convocadas a esta conversación, así que disculpadme si en algún momento os caigo antipática. No es nada personal, es simplemente la importancia de limitarnos en el tiempo. Este conversatorio, pues de él forman parte Irene Montero, ministra de Igualdad del Gobierno de España desde el año 2020, licenciada en Psicología por la Universidad Autónoma y máster de Psicología de la Educación. Ha estado vinculada, pues, desde muy joven a movimientos estudiantiles y sociales, especialmente en el trabajo de la plataforma Afectados por la Hipoteca, y forma parte de nuestro poder legislativo desde el año 2015. Destaca, desde luego, el trabajo que desde el Ministerio de Igualdad ella ha liderado para la aprobación de la Ley Orgánica de Garantía Integral de la Libertad Sexual, la Ley para la Igualdad Real y Efectiva de las Personas Trans y para la Garantía de los Derechos de las Personas LGTBI y la reforma de la Ley de la Salud Sexual y Reproductiva. Aún así, el trabajo del Ministerio no ha acabado y todavía, pues, hay temas pendientes, medidas pendientes, y se sigue, me consta, trabajando a toda vela para avanzar en muchas de las políticas que puedan hacer la implementación de lo que ya se ha aprobado. Junto a la ministra de Igualdad del Gobierno de España está Marjan Hammersma. Marjan Hammersma es secretaria general del Ministerio de Educación, Cultura y Ciencia de Países Bajos desde el año 2016. Anteriormente fue directora general de Cultura y Medios de Comunicación, y desde ahí sabemos también que estudió Sociología en la Universidad de Utrecht y se graduó en Ciencias de la Comunicación en la Universidad de Ámsterdam. Irena Mosova es la directora para la Igualdad y la No Discriminación de la Unión Europea en el Departamento de Justicia de la Comisión Europea. Se incorporó a la Comisión en 2006 como jefa de representación de la Unión Europea en Praga y desde el año 91 hasta el 2006 trabajó en el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores de la República Checa, de la República Federal Checa y Eslovaca, ostentando varios puestos directivos. Si me quedo hierro en alguna de las cosas que diga de ustedes, me disculpan y las completan o las rectifican. La señora Mosova se graduó en la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Charles de Praga y ha realizado estudios de posgrado en la Academia Diplomática de Madrid. Uge Sangil, pues es nacida en la isla de Palma, esto es importante, es educadora social y trabaja desde hace más de 2 décadas para la Administración Pública en la isla de Tenerife, en un centro de alto rendimiento para personas con discapacidad psíquica y física. En 2005 se vinculó a la Federación Estatal de Lesbianas, Gays, Trans, Bisexuales, Intersexuales y MAX, y a partir del 2012 empezó a asumir la coordinación del Grupo de Educación de la LGTBIQ+, y en 2018 es elegida como presidenta de esta federación, puesto que ha renovado recientemente en 2021, pues hasta la actualidad. Desde la LGTBI+, ha coordinado todo lo que es la campaña de incidencia política y movilización estatal del activismo para impulsar la aprobación de la ley trans y de la ley LGTBI, además de para impulsar el pacto social contra los discursos de odio que se firmó en febrero del 2023, creo que es. Ekram Kubanichok-Bikop, más o menos. Ekram es de ILGA Europa, se unió a ILGA Europa en 2020, comenzó su activismo en 2008 en Kirguistán y antes de unirse a ILGA Europa, pues trabajó en la Oficina Regional del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos en Asia Central como consultor de Estado de Derecho y es licenciado en Derecho Internacional de los Derechos Humanos en la Universidad de Essex en el Reino Unido. Dentro de ILGA desarrolla la implementación de estrategias de promoción e iniciativas de política para generar cambios legales, políticos y sociales para las personas LGBTIQ en Europa y Asia Central. Francesca Sanders es originaria de Australia y antes de unirse a Transgender Europe, pues su trabajo se centró en política de desarrollo internacional, la igualdad de género en el mercado laboral y el compromiso de Australia con instituciones financieras internacionales. Estudió en la Escuela de Economía y Derecho de Berlín, de la Universidad Nacional de Australia y la Universidad de Tokio, y es la responsable de las políticas de Transgender Europe, donde lidera el equipo de política y trabaja todo aquello que tenga que ver con luchar, con combatir la violencia antitrans, promover las prácticas laborales transinclusivas y fortalecer los marcos legales frente a la discriminación. Sophie West-Brown es la primera especialista global de Naciones Unidas de mujer, ¿no? de un woman, dedicada a derechos e igualdad LGBTIQ+. Trabaja para asegurar que las perspectivas interseccionales lleguen a todas las áreas de trabajo de Naciones Unidas y colabora extensamente en promover los derechos para las personas LGBTIQ+ y abordar las desigualdades de género poniendo el foco en mujeres y niñas LGBTIQ+. Lleva 19 años trabajando en la confluencia, en la intersección de todas estas causas LGTBIQ+, género y justicia social y medioambiental en política, programación, investigación y apoyo en Naciones Unidas, además de con organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Magdalena Wilczynska, abogada de derechos humanos, especializada en libertad de expresión y Estado de Derecho. Tiene una doble maestría en Derecho y Periodismo en la Universidad de Varsovia. Es experta en desinformación. Ha estado en la oficina del Defensor del Pueblo de Polonia y ahí ha ocupado casos sobre libertad de expresión, libertad de reunión, Estado de Derecho, independencia del Poder Judicial. En este momento lidera el equipo de expertos en desinformación de la Academia Polaca-Japonesa de Tecnología de la Información y coordina la investigación de desinformación en Europa que se está llevando a cabo por parte de la organización TechShow. Es doctoranda de la Academia Polaca de Ciencias y todas sus tesis van dirigidas a las soluciones legales a la desinformación. Muchas gracias. Bueno, vamos a pasar directamente a las preguntas. Voy a ir formulando preguntas una a una. Pues tenemos como unos 5 minutos aproximadamente. Lo del tiempo sí es importante porque queremos ser puntuales para respetar también a quienes después vienen con la obra de teatro y que están también con la inquietud de compartir su arte. Y quizá en este primer turno yo creo que habría que empezar por la ministra de Igualdad, Irene Montero, para conocer qué medidas ha venido tomando el Gobierno de España para combatir los discursos de odio, especialmente quizá esas medidas que tienen que ver más con el ámbito de la igualdad, el ámbito educativo, ¿no? Los ámbitos que no son directamente los de la securitización.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias, Violeta. ¿Se escucha bien, verdad? Gracias, Violeta, y gracias a todas las compañeras que me acompañan en esta mesa y que además dedican buena parte de su vida, de sus esfuerzos a garantizar los derechos de las personas LGTBI, por supuesto, a todas, todos y todes quienes estáis en esta sala. Por ir concretas y rápidas y ajustarnos a los tiempos, yo creo que el primer mensaje importante frente a los discursos de odio es entender lo que son, y yo creo que son sobre todo una respuesta a los avances democráticos de una sociedad. Es decir, los discursos de odio, en España lo estamos viendo con mucha claridad, están creciendo cuando hay un crecimiento social e institucional de los derechos de las personas LGTBI y también de su visibilidad, que no es una cuestión menor y es el primer punto al que quiero referirme, ¿no? Como la legitimación desde las instituciones de la visibilidad de las personas LGTBI, particularmente de las personas trans, que están siendo una de las dianas más importantes de los discursos de odio, pero no solo. Yo creo que es fundamental, porque no podemos dejar nunca de mandar el mensaje de que estamos dispuestas a cumplir con todas nuestras obligaciones como instituciones. Los derechos LGTBI son derechos humanos y, por tanto, es obligación de las instituciones, al menos de los países que hemos hecho parte de nuestra legislación interna, de los derechos humanos, es obligación cumplirlos y hacerlos cumplir. Y por tanto creo que legitimar esa visibilidad y las bases legales y las bases y los consensos humanos que nos han permitido construir estos derechos, creo que es una obligación. Y por tanto, creo que esa idea de Audre Lorde de tu silencio no te protegerá toma mucho sentido, ¿no? Yo entiendo que el silencio a veces es una estrategia legítima para hacer frente a la violencia por parte de algunas personas LGTBI que no pueden, no se sienten con fuerza o están en un momento de su vida, sea en un contexto o en varios, en la familia, en el trabajo, en un lugar de ocio, de mantener el silencio o de no visibilizarse como estrategia legítima para defenderse. Pero como sociedad, y eso implica una responsabilidad colectiva también de las instituciones, pero también una responsabilidad individual, creo que siempre que podamos, la respuesta puede ser cualquiera menos el silencio. Es decir, tenemos que responder, estemos en el contexto de un bar y sea una broma aparentemente, no sé, neutra o una cosa que nos pueda parecer menor, ¿no? Que nos respondan, oye, qué exagerada, tampoco hace falta ser la policía de las bromas. Bueno, pues sí, porque detrás de los discursos de odio vienen las acciones violentas que terminan en que se asesine a una persona, como el caso de Samuel, ¿no? Al grito de maricón. Entonces creo que socialmente tenemos la responsabilidad de responder, de no callar, aunque podamos comprender que hay personas que en determinados momentos necesiten el silencio o la invisibilidad como estrategia legítima para defenderse de la violencia y que particularmente cuando tenemos una responsabilidad pública o institucional no se nos puede olvidar que desde el momento en el que somos representantes públicos defender los derechos LGTBI no debería ser una opción, es una obligación porque los derechos de las personas LGTBI, el derecho a ser, es un derecho material y fundamental, forma parte de los derechos humanos y por tanto no es una opción defenderlos, es una obligación cumplirlos y hacerlos cumplir. En segundo lugar, creo que hay una tarea que en Europa y en España nos estamos tomando en serio que tiene que ver con consolidar el derecho antidiscriminatorio. En la ley trans y de derechos LGTBI también abordamos esta cuestión en el título cuarto y, por tanto, cuando realmente se cometen delitos de odio, tienen que tener una sanción y tienen también que tener una reparación las víctimas de esas conductas. Y esa reparación no me parece menor, la reparación individual y la reparación social, que la sociedad mande un mensaje a las personas que sufren violencia LGTBI fóbica de que esta sociedad no lo tolera y que va a haber una reparación colectiva, ¿no? a esas personas. Y por último, toda la cuestión relacionada con la educación. No es casualidad, yo creo que los sectores más reaccionarios de nuestra sociedad sitúen los derechos LGTBI y la educación sexual, la educación para la igualdad, la educación en diversidad, como un elemento central de sus ataques, porque es desde la educación desde donde podemos trabajar. La educación en el sentido más amplio, no solo la educación formal, los contextos de educación informal, los espacios deportivos en los que nuestras criaturas desarrollan su vida, los espacios donde se desarrolla la vida de los niños, las niñas y las niñas, tienen que ser espacios seguros y tienen que ser espacios en los que en todo momento, no solo, insisto, en una clase concreta, en todo momento haya un profundo respeto porque todo el mundo pueda ser quien es, sin sufrir miedo, discriminación, burla, porque se aprenda a cuidar y a proteger esa diversidad y porque todas aprendamos desde muy pequeñas a comprender que podemos ser quienes somos, que tenemos derecho a ser quienes somos y que no hay vidas más valiosas que otras o vidas más legítimas que otras. En ese sentido también me parece muy importante cuidar nuestra cultura, porque muchas veces lo que un discurso político no llega, ¿no? O no puede llegar. Hay a personas que les llega, pero hay muchas que no. Sin embargo, la cultura es capaz de remover cosas y precisamente por eso tampoco me parece casualidad que los sectores reaccionarios, allá donde tienen el poder para hacerlo, cancelen representaciones culturales, como esta mañana señalaba la secretaria de Estado, que precisamente muestran esa diversidad de la sociedad y legitiman la posibilidad de que cualquier persona pueda ser quien es y denuncian la violencia, la estigmatización que se ha ejercido durante muchas décadas contra las personas LGTBI en todas las sociedades y que a día de hoy sigue ocurriendo. Entonces creo que desde el ámbito educativo y cultural tenemos que hacer una labor también institucional de mucha protección, ¿no? Igual que antes decía que hay que proteger y legitimar desde las instituciones a la sociedad civil, porque muchas veces allá donde no llega el Estado llegan los colectivos. También creo que la cultura y la educación son espacios en toda su diversidad que tenemos que cuidar y proteger, porque desde ahí es desde donde llegamos muchas veces a facilitar que mucha gente reflexione piense, se abra a realidades que a lo mejor en su entorno más cercano no ha conocido y sobre todo haga esa reflexión que yo creo que es el corazón de la democracia, que es el respeto a todas las personas y desear lo mismo para la gente que más quieres que para la que no conoces de nada y por tanto garantizar que todo el mundo puede ser quien es.
Muchas gracias. Yo creo que ahí hay palabras clave, ¿no? Como son visibilidad, educación, legitimación, educación, cultura, pues que son fundamentales. Marjan Hammersman, desde su gobierno, ¿cómo se está afrontando el discurso de odio hacia las personas LGTBIQ+, y qué medidas se están poniendo en marcha para contrarrestar estos discursos de odio?
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel. Well, let me first start that we know that the path to progress is not always a straight one. Emancipation also requires, and increasingly requires, the ability to deal with opposing forces. And the tone of the debate in the Netherlands is becoming increasingly polarized nowadays. Recently, there have been several worrying incidents of violence against LGBTIQ+ persons in the Netherlands. Physical violence against employees of a LGBTIQ-friendly bar in Groningen. Violence against an LGBT advocacy group in Eindhoven. Flag burnings and verbal abuse in football stadiums. And not to mention bullying behavior in streets and online, which does not make the media at all. Our government stands for all people to feel safe and to have space to become who they want to be. And the Dutch LGBT Monitor of 2022 shows that LGBT people regularly face violence and discrimination in public spaces. And this occurs in the form of physical, verbal, or online violence. And this is unacceptable for us. And I would like to highlight 6 governmental measures in place or in development for the moment. First, I would like to highlight that prior to the last national elections in 2021, 10 parties committed to the Rainbow Ballot Box Agreement. And by signing this agreement, the various parties committed to measures to address discriminatory violence, improve legislation, and promote acceptance of LGBTIQ+ persons in general. Second, this year, Article 1 of the Constitution of our country was revised and sexual orientation and gender identity added as non-discrimination grounds. And this allows our legal framework to treat online discrimination the same as offline discrimination. It is prohibited now. And third are our measures to prevent online discrimination in education and school environments. We think that is very important, so we have launched programs for elementary and high school students which focus on online empowerment and hate speech. And additionally, a web page is launched where people can report online discrimination, and in this way we as a government can analyze those individual reports and find patterns and trends. And consequently, this can lead to better policies, we hope. Moreover, the Public Prosecution Office has explicitly prioritized discriminatory offences, offline and online, and the Public Prosecution Office also actively communicates publicly about such cases, which is a change in policy. And this measure reinforces the social norm that discrimination is unacceptable. And finally, the coming year will be used to explore and develop additional policy options to intensify our efforts against online discrimination, because this government has specifically pledged to intensify efforts to better protect the LGBTIQ+ community in the Netherlands. So I think some concrete actions and some actions of which the effect should be seen in the future, but it is top priority of this government at the moment.
Thank you very much. Muy interesante, ¿no? Todo lo que estamos escuchando y que además va en la misma línea, ¿no? De la visibilidad, de la legitimación, de las escuelas, de cómo luchar contra la discriminación. Irena Mozova, claro, ahí es interesante saber qué acciones desde la Comisión Europea, ¿no?, se están llevando a cabo, ¿no? Vemos que los Estados miembros, ¿no?, pues, llevan una serie de medidas muy dirigidas, ¿no?, a los ámbitos que estamos viendo, pero para garantizar la protección de las personas LGTBIQ+ en Europa, frente a esas violencias desde la Comisión, ¿qué se puede hacer y qué se está haciendo?
Muchas gracias por invitarme, por la palabra, y también déjame empezar por mi agradecimiento a la presidencia española por organizar esta conferencia, que es prácticamente el primer evento de la presidencia española después de la visita del presidente del Consejo y también del Colegio de los Comisarios. Eso solamente muestra cuál importancia da la presidencia española a los derechos de la gente LGBTIQ. Y me disculpo porque no suelo hablar tanto en español, pues voy a continuar en inglés, que es el idioma que hablo más a menudo. So, dear participants, so thank you very much for having me. I have a practical affectation to this city where I spent actually 5 years of my professional life. But I have to admit that it's changed a lot. It changed a lot in terms of supporting democracy, supporting fundamental freedoms, supporting with targeted national policies the rights of the LGBTI people here in Spain, but also in Europe. It is very important to combine, as also Minister said from Netherlands, the national policies, national legislation with the action at the European level. Let me say that my Commissioner Helena Dalli earlier today, so she was very clear. We are still, while we have a very solid basis in the treaties, the whole European Union is built up on the values, democracy, fundamental rights, equality. We are still missing one important piece of legislation, which is the Horizontal Equal Treatment Directive. And we should work together in a way to unblock it and have it adopted as soon as possible before the European Parliament elections, so we can have the legislative base also at the European level to protect the rights of the LGBTIQ people. I think it was the Secretary of State, she mentioned earlier today that we are facing a changing environment in some member states as well. We have seen LGBTI-free zones. We have seen also banned books which portrayed a kissing lesbian couple. And this is something which is not acceptable. But let's face it also that we do not have always at the European level the necessary tools in order to address it. But we've been very creative. So for the LGBTIQ-free zones, we have used the argument of money, funding, and we have deprived those municipalities claiming to be LGBTI-free from the funding of the European Union. When we have seen that there is a new tool by banning certain books with certain harmful content, we have again sued the country in question because it is against the rules of the internal market. So these are our creative solutions where we are really trying to help the people on the ground, but of course the legislative framework is a key. While we have already the framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia from 2008, it is mainly covering the grounds on race, color, religion, descent of national or ethnic origin. That's why, and it was also already explained by the Commissioner Dalli, we have proposed to add the European crime legislation in order to be, as a Commission, able to come with a secondary legislation which could then protect more comprehensively rights of the LGBTIQ people in Europe. Well, of course, we need, again, unanimity. We need all the member states in the Council to proceed with this amendment of the treaty in order to have the secondary legislation being proposed by the Commission. But we hope that, again, with the member states, so we can work together in order to achieve this new, I would say, level of the architecture of the protection of human rights. Next week we will propose another piece of legislation, which is actually the amendment to the Victims' Rights Directive. You know that we have done extensive evaluation. Maybe many of you also contributed to this evaluation. On the basis of that, so we are looking on the way, so how to strengthen the rights of the victims, how to strengthen the awareness of their rights, how to make them more aware, so where to seek for the help, through the dedicated helpline. And congratulations again to the Spanish presidency, because I understand that from today, from this morning, so the new helpline, 28th of July, Arco Iris? Yes, is already in function. I hope you would not need to have too much support, so the discrimination will be growing down, but it's absolutely essential to have such a tool. And we will have such a tool also at the European level very soon. I would like to very shortly mention also a very important campaign, Ace Open, which we are dedicating in 10 member states as a start. We are targeting young people between 18 and 30 years old in 10 member states in order to support, recognize the victim, and also provide the support by the bystanders. Because this is not only about the legislation, it is not only about the funding, but this is also about the normal people on the streets, to detect, to support, and to help. And last but not least, of course, the funding. I should say that we are helping numerous civil society organizations on the ground. We are supporting also umbrella organizations at the European level. And through the Erasmus Plus, there are hundreds of millions of euros which are supporting young population, and Minister mentioned education. This is a key avenue as well. So through those projects, through the Erasmus Plus, we are supporting the better understanding of young people. So what does it mean to be LGBTIQ person, and how to embrace, how to accept, how to support in order that we are all living in the value-based and free from discrimination Europe.
Muchas gracias. Realmente importante algunos aspectos mencionados, ¿no? Como la directiva que está pendiente de aprobarse, el tema de las víctimas. Y claro, en España estamos un poco sensibles con el tema de la cancelación o de la prohibición, ¿no? de la cultura o de lo que tiene que ver con libros o con películas, ¿no? Recientemente hemos visto cómo se ha cancelado una película en un pueblo de la Comunidad de Madrid, pues Leguías, ¿no? Por el beso de dos mujeres, ¿no? Con lo cual, bueno, pues esto es algo que nos inquieta mucho y que en España estamos especialmente sensibles. Precisamente de España, Uge Sangil, presidenta de la LGTB, poder conocer, ¿no? Cómo el discurso anti-LGTBI va aumentando, qué efectos está teniendo, ¿no? En la comunidad y por qué la visibilidad bueno, pues trae estas complicaciones, ¿no?
Nada, buenas tardes, gracias por contar con nosotros. Son dos preguntas en una, voy a intentar ser breve. Y el discurso anti-LGTBI ha aumentado notablemente, ¿no? Y hemos detectado que puede ser por varias vías. Un discurso ultra de voz y hazte oír, el discurso gender critical o TERF y el discurso institucional antitrans. En el primer discurso, el ultra de Vox, hazte oír, contra el colectivo LGTBI+, son discursos sobre homonacionalistas y de raíz religiosa. Estos niegan que el colectivo esté discriminado y alimentan bulos transfobos. Y son discursos que señalan y que estigmatizan al colectivo como enfermos, como chiringuitos, como degenerados subvencionados, como que mutilamos a menores, etcétera, etcétera. Su enfoque es el presentar los derechos del colectivo como algo ideológico y que los buenos homosexuales son los que se sienten españoles, pero no gays o lesbianas, y lo llevan en silencio y aceptan que son inferiores en derechos frente a la familia tradicional. Son posiblemente los segundos discursos más agresivos y cuentan con algunos referentes de tercera fila en forma de streamers o influencers. En los discursos gender critical o TERF, estos son alimentados por mujeres tradicionalmente feministas que compran marcos de la ultraderecha. Su discurso es una versión del discurso contra la inmigración, hablando de que las mujeres están siendo invadidas, que se invaden sus espacios, sus símbolos por los hombres y que son las mujeres trans. Además se centran en los menores trans, en el tema de la hormonación, el deporte de hombres que se hacen pasar por mujeres, baños y similares elementos que movilizan miedo contra las personas trans. Este discurso es el más agresivo en redes sociales y es realmente muy violento, señalando a personas trans, poniendo imágenes suyas, burlándose de ellas, etc. Difunden muchísimos bulos y datos falsos, copiados en su mayoría del Reino Unido, y la mayor parte de las mujeres que repiten estos discursos vienen de la órbita del feminismo socialista, pero no solo, porque con el tiempo el discurso ha calado entre otras mujeres. Hay muchas referentes en forma de escritoras, influencers y demás que repiten estos mensajes. Y la tercera vía que hemos detectado es el institucional antitrans. Es el discurso que es articulado una parte del Partido Socialista y que está muy solapado con el discurso TERF. Pero es mucho más medido y es más institucional, aunque en ocasiones ha llegado a ser muy violento, como por ejemplo cuando Carmen Calvo apuntó que la identidad de las personas trans ponía en peligro la de 47 millones de personas y hace énfasis en el tema de menores y en la seguridad jurídica. En cuanto a la visibilidad, entendemos que la clave es realizar una visibilidad en positivo, hablar de derechos que sumen para todo el mundo, que sumen para el colectivo, pero también para el conjunto de la población y evitar el choque frontal que genera polarización con mujeres feministas especialmente. Además, es fundamental que la visibilidad se articule de forma colectiva, no de manera individual y de forma conjunta en el colectivo LGTBI, porque es evidente que la ultraderecha quiere centrar el debate en lo trans y porque las personas trans son menos y son menos conocidas y busca dividirnos internamente. Se debe hablar de todo el colectivo y debemos actuar como un colectivo en conjunto. Y es importante también evitar enfoques de visibilidad que planteen que no se puede debatir o que se articulan desde el reproche moral. Debe articularse desde la apertura, desde el diálogo con toda la sociedad y desde el avance en derechos, desde la libertad que no perjudica a nadie y no desde obligaciones a terceros. Y es importante, y voy terminando, entender que nuestra visibilidad depende totalmente de la libertad de expresión. Nuestra visibilidad es en realidad libertad de expresión y defender que hay expresiones que no deben ser legales es un error que acaba afectándonos rápidamente. También es fundamental que la visibilidad sea conjunta, no solo de nuestro colectivo, sino también de las mujeres, tejiendo alianzas conjuntas.
Muchas gracias, Uji. Me quedo con la parte que has dicho de la visibilidad y la libertad de expresión, ¿no? Con todo lo que está pasando con las banderas en nuestro país también, y cómo toda esa información, que luego hablaremos, me imagino, más profundamente de todo este tema, ¿no? Utiliza esa visibilidad precisamente para visibilizar supuestamente todo lo perverso que también tenemos las personas LGBTIQ+, ¿no? Entonces, ahí hay una cara de doble raso, ¿no? De doble nivel que se nos puede volver en nuestra contra si no es desde lo colectivo, ¿no? Y esto efectivamente es muy importante. Por eso yo creo que los datos, las herramientas son fundamentales. De ahí, bueno, pues Ekram Kubanic-Kobov nos podría decir, ¿no?, de qué manera los datos, las herramientas que desde IGA Europa, desde el Annual Review, vais haciendo, ponen de manifiesto las situaciones de las personas LGTBIQ+, para poder contrarrestar esos discursos de odio.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank Spanish Ministry for inviting ILGA Europe and specifically to talk about our tools that were developed together with the activists. So ILGA Europe actually represents over 700 organizations from 54 countries. And we do have several tools. One of them is Rainbow Europe, and based on the Rainbow Europe is a Rainbow Index, which ranks all the countries and specifically monitors legal and policy improvement regarding the SOGIESC and rights of LGBTI people. And the second one is the annual review, is the comprehensive yearly assessment of the violation of rights of LGBTI people in all these 54 countries. So we have these tools, and why do we need these tools? So one is to monitor and raise awareness about policy and legal situation in each country, and the second is looking at the practice, because oftentimes legal provisions can be very inclusive, very comprehensive, But when it comes to the real lived realities of LGBTI people, it can look very different. And as earlier it was noted by the earlier speakers, that when even we compare 2012 and 2019 surveys, we do see that there was and we compare our Rainbow Europe, then we can see that at the legal level there were some improvements, but when it comes to practice, when it comes to experience of LGBTI people, there was the stagnation or very little improvement, which data shows. And why it is important is, so how we can use it to counter the hate speech. To begin with, it's a raising awareness about what kind of legal policy measures can be, and we do link to specific laws or policies. For example, some governments are thinking, okay, we need to work on countering hate speech, and what we can do. And then you can go to the website and look. You can even select hate speech based on the sex characteristics, for example. And you can see in how many countries have this policy or legal measures already adopted. And you can even find the link and have a look and maybe get inspired. So one is the raising awareness. And the second, an annual review gives us a real picture, what's happening. And we monitor with our members in each individual country. We monitor hate speech by religious, by political leaders, by media. So you can also see the trends in each country, what kind of trends. And as well as there are also trainings, we also monitor what is being done. So it is about what's happening and seeing the trends, plus getting inspired by what your peers or other member states are doing. And then second one is it is very important for the advocacy and policy change, and specifically for activists from each member state or even from at the European level, because often said it's evidence-based policy is important, and for that we need the data and also show that can be achieved and what's happening, and how many member states, for example, do provide protection based on this ground or that ground. And also, for example, our members, for example, in Spain, this is just an example, can come like, for example, the legal gender recognition based on self-ID. So, and then what is this? And how we can approach this? Then you can show like here, for example, in these countries, it's already happened, and you can use it, and like it's used also for improvement, which actually also counters hate speech as well. Can be used for hate speech, and then other one is the accountability, because we do hear from the platforms, especially it's like international platforms, big words about commitments made, but then we see through these tools how they are being implemented. We monitor also. And especially when it comes to hate speech, we also detect if there's anything being done. And there's also parts on the hate speech, you can have a look. And the other one is the capacity building. As I said, there is also parts where we do talk about what each member states are doing, as well as civil society in the given country. So you can also understand, sometimes they also say that, okay, there is not enough attention paid by the police to the online hate speech, even though we are being reported a lot of hate speech, which means police either they have very low capacity or it's not priority, and then you can have a look at this data and also decide, okay, here maybe we need to pay more attention if you want to counter hate speech. For example, and also, as I already mentioned, it's a best practices plus cooperation. It can also be used for cooperation. As I mentioned, it gives you kind of situation in each country, both in legal and also practice. And for example, in some member states are, okay, I want to counter online hate speech. Who is doing what? You can have a look, and you can reach out to either us or directly to the peer member states. And just finally, going off the track, but important message, I wanted to say that when you countering hate speech, and especially by the government officials or politicians, it is very important actively, proactively counter and offer to the community the other message. Because if you are not countering or you are not speaking out this certain rhetoric, then you are leaving the community only with this rhetoric, and that's it. And that's why you should actively counter this kind of rhetoric with your own message, so they will have kind of balanced information about LGBTI people. So this is one of the, I think, most important messages, and I completely agree with other measures regarding the education, and I'm pretty sure others will talk, but I will stop here because of the time limitations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekram. Yo creo que es muy claro, ¿no? Toda esta parte de los mensajes claros por parte de las instituciones, de las administraciones, de los referentes, ¿no? Que no dejen a las comunidades solas, es fundamental, ¿no? Porque al final la visibilidad, la legitimidad, todo lo que estamos hablando, se construye también desde ese discurso, ¿no? Que contrapone la retórica del odio y el lenguaje del odio. Francesca Sanders, desde el proyecto Trans Murder Monitoring de Transgender Europe, venís haciendo un análisis quizá de uno de los aspectos más duros de la violencia, ¿no? Que sufren las personas trans, ¿no? ¿Cómo ha ido evolucionando durante estos años esta violencia y qué conexión veis vosotras y vosotros, que hay vosotros, entre el discurso de odio, esta violencia y las personas trans, ¿no? Un poco qué es lo que está pasando, cuál es el sufrimiento, qué es lo que observáis desde Transgender Europe.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll take off my headphones so I don't hear myself speaking. But thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and also I want to echo what my colleagues have said. Thanks to the Spanish presidency for making this statement by hosting this event in the first few days of the presidency. And it's really meaningful also that we can be here and talk about this issue of hate speech and violence, which unfortunately is so prevalent and only increasing. So I'll introduce myself, Francesca. I work for Transgender Europe. For those of you who don't know, we're an umbrella network organization, a membership-based organization. We have over 200 members across 50 countries in Europe and Central Asia, and our mission is to strengthen the rights and well-being of trans people in the region. And the Trans Murder Monitoring Project is a data gathering project that began in 2008 to track murders of trans people across the world. And this data is released each year on the Trans Day of Remembrance in November. And what we're seeing with this data is that murders are unfortunately only increasing, as you might expect. I have some numbers here. There were, in 2022, 327 trans people recorded murdered globally, compared to 121 in 2008. And of course, some of that increase is going to be connected to an increase in reporting, but unfortunately it's also an increase in violence that we're seeing across the world. What you may know is that trans people experience a stigma and oppression, structural discrimination that leads to violence. For starting at the home, a lot of trans people experience a lot of family rejection. They are kicked out of home. They have to flee their homes or even their countries because it's not safe to be where they are. Many trans people experience homelessness, unemployment. Those who are living in precarious living situations are then exposed to further violence. Those who are forced to flee their home countries might be undocumented migrants. They might be asylum seekers. So many trans people are experiencing intersecting axes of oppression, including racism, including sexism, misogyny, xenophobia. Many trans people are forced to find work in sex work because it's the only way to survive, which is also then criminalized, which also then exposes them to all kinds of violence again. And then when we look at the statistics that we see at the Transmurder Monitoring Project, we see that 95% of murders recorded are trans women and trans feminine people. A third of the people killed in Europe are migrants. And when we know the occupation of the person killed, it's 50% of the time they are sex workers. So the data is backing up, unfortunately, what we know about trans people's experience. And then talking about the evolution of this violence and the evolution of the reports that we're hearing. In the beginning, when we started collecting this data, it was mostly trans women sex workers in Turkey and also Italy that were being reported killed. And then in recent years, this is spreading across all of Europe. Last year, for the first time, Estonia and Switzerland also recorded murders of trans people. And these are countries that were previously considered safe. They might be considered safer than others. And so what we're seeing is this increase in violence. We heard about the connection between visibility and violence. And it's certainly true that trans people are becoming more visible. We are seeing trans people in the news, in TV shows, which is wonderful. This is, trans people are a part of our world, and they absolutely have a place. But unfortunately, it means that then their rights are being challenged, and they are very visible, which means that they're also under attack. And this, I want to emphasize that this is real violence that is happening, unfortunately, and this is in counter to the fears that the trans women in particular may pose to the rest of society, which are actually theoretical and not based in evidence. And so that leads me to the part of the question about hate speech and the connection with hate crimes. So we know, we've heard from our colleagues that hate speech is increasing. We have an increase in anti-trans discourse against trans people, especially trans women, about women's spaces being invaded, about these threats to cis women. And so this leads to discrimination against these groups, and then in the worst case, it leads to violence. And we're also increasingly hearing reports of politicians, of authorities being the perpetrators of hate speech and hate crimes. We've heard of that already. And we're also very concerned that this is only going to increase in the lead up to the EU elections next year. We see this as a very real possibility that we ask everyone in this room to do what you can to counter it, as Akram has mentioned, to do what you can to prevent that, to prevent the instrumentalization and the weaponization of trans people. And just to close, to say that this connection between hate speech and it starts out as hate speech and as discourse, but then it can have a real impact on the way that trans people access their rights. For example, trans women being banned from accessing emergency shelters, from not being able to access swimming pools, change rooms, locker rooms, bathrooms. But it can also translate into the impact on policy. So when we hear about trans access to healthcare being weaponized, and then this actually ends up having an impact on the ability of trans people to access their needed healthcare. This also has an impact on legal gender recognition procedures when governments are unfortunately not able to pass laws that would otherwise enable trans people to do simple things like change their documents to match their gender identity. Thanks.
Muchas gracias. Yo creo que la situación de las personas trans es una situación que nos preocupa y nos inquieta, especialmente también a quienes nos calificamos en el mundo de los feminismos como feministas, ¿no? Y ahí yo creo que también la mirada que nos puede aportar Sophie West-Brown es bien interesante, ¿no? Porque pues en muchas ocasiones hay relaciones, hay interrelaciones, ¿no? Entre los derechos de las mujeres, entre las personas LGTBI, entre las personas trans, ¿no? Todos esos retrocesos que a veces se quieren entremezclar y confundir respecto a quienes pierden y cómo se sitúan los derechos humanos cuando son universales, son para todas y todos y todes, sin entrar en conflicto, ¿no? Y cómo se manifiesta, pues toda esa relación desde la perspectiva de Naciones Unidas, como lo estáis analizando y viendo.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for hosting the event, and thanks for inviting me to participate. So there's two parts to the question. Let me just begin by stating that the pushback against rights for women as well as LGBTIQ+ people are inseparable. And at risk of stating the obvious, I want to just provide the intersectional underpinning for that, which is firstly that many LGBTIQ+ people are also women. And they face forms of violence and discrimination that are both common to, but also distinct from the experiences of women who do not identify as LGBTIQ+. Secondly, there are many more people who do not identify as women or girls, but also face violence and discrimination on the basis of their gender identity, their gender expression, or because of their sex characteristics. So it's really the gendered nature of the pushback that I think is the common threat here. And therefore, I think we need an intersectional gender analysis in all of our approaches to addressing pushback, to combating hate speech, and that's the approach of the UN as well. But of course, the pushback is not a new phenomenon, but there are key features that set the newer anti-rights movements apart from what we've seen in the past, and those features are many. I just want to highlight 4 particular ones today. So those are the key drivers, the claims framing that we're seeing, the alliances and the actors, and the tactics that are used across both areas of pushback. So let me just break down those areas for a moment. So the key drivers, they stem from the same patriarchal norms, structures and ideologies that privilege certain heterosexual and cisgender men and boys. And we see this increase in the context of rises in autocratic and populist governments, as well as in the context of crises and so on. Resistance to deviation from sexual and gender norms in particular are driven by the same regressive goals around certain perceptions of gender hierarchies, and are linked with other exclusionary ideologies, as others have alluded to, racism, xenophobia, and so on. Secondly, the same claims framing is seen across both areas of pushback. So there's quite a long history of portraying the concept of gender, as well as the gamut of LGBTIQ+ human rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, comprehensive sexuality education, and so on, as being in opposition to social order, to morality, to so-called traditional family values. And certainly we've seen that in UN spaces, at least since the early 1990s. But what we're seeing in more recent times, as I think everyone is familiar with, is the way that this coalesces these days around a framing of fighting gender ideology, which seeks to capture the broad opposition to all of these areas of rights, but also really lasering in on transgender rights, as Francesca and others have already highlighted. And you know, debate has come up a bit, and I think one of the other claims framing and tactics that we're seeing is around this framing of LGBTIQ+ realities as up for debate. But it's not a debate, you know. Fundamental human rights are not a debate. So we need to get out of that being pulled into to participating in this as though it is a debate. Thirdly, the same actors and alliances are seen across both areas of pushback. They're increasingly joining forces across regions and sectors. They're coordinated, they're well-funded, they're seeking greater opportunities for political influence and resonance in alliance with other interest groups. As I'm sure many people are familiar with, you know, the alliances that we see with xenophobic, nationalistic, men's rights, gender-critical groups, and so on. They're increasingly in national political, legal and policy spheres, theology, media, and various parts of civil society. Fourthly, the same tactics are used across both areas of pushback. They target the interrelationship between both sets of rights in an effort to weaken both of them, as well as to sow the divisions, which I'll get into a bit more later. They focus on contentious gender-related policies that seemingly question the relationship between the state and organised religion or culture. And they garner a public sense of moral panic around this and then position the nation or the family as the solution to that. So overall, and we see it across regions, the rhetoric and trends are converging as strands of democratic decline. And by that, without getting into it, I'm broadly referring to the control of, or the extreme control of rights and freedoms and dissent. So how do we see this manifest at the UN? So we're experiencing immense political pressure in UN organisations to not speak up or act on any LGBTIQ+ issues. Of course, that doesn't stop us, but it certainly complicates our approaches and our strategies. And I mean that institutionally, intergovernmentally, as well as operationally. So just quickly, with regards to the intergovernmental sphere that I'm sure some of you work in, of course, these actors have been around these spaces for quite a long time, but what we're seeing more and more is an increasingly formal presence within member state delegations that systematically seek to undermine human rights treaties and mechanisms, as well as dilute and question a gender-inclusive language and human rights standards. The backsliding on norms and policies at the country level, of course, has many negative impacts across the board, including in legal and policy spheres. For the UN, it impacts directly on our ability to work on certain policy and programmatic issues at the country level. And the shrinking of civic space at country level absolutely impacts on the UN's ability to reach, to coordinate with and support civil society actors on the ground and our partners. Lastly, as far as the UN system is concerned, as you mentioned, I work in UN Women, so for me, and particularly in my role, I really see that UN Women is situated on the tectonic plate of this combined pushback and these tensions. And by tensions, I'm referring to the proliferation of anti-gender narratives in some women's rights spaces. And overall, the pushback hampers substantive gender equality efforts in a number of ways, from policies to feminist organising, and really seeks to divide those who should be united on gender equality and human rights efforts.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Sophie. Esas narrativas, ¿no?, que mencionas tienen mucho que ver con la desinformación, y ahí Magdalena Wilczynska bueno, pues nos puede aportar mucho análisis, ¿no? Dentro de esos discursos de odio es muy importante incidir en la importancia que tienen todas estas técnicas de desinformación, ¿no? Quizás lo que nos gustaría conocer es de qué manera y a qué velocidad se van abriendo camino en la sociedad los bulos, la desinformación acerca del colectivo LGBTIQ+, y quiénes son los grandes promotores de estos bulos en Europa.
Thank you, and thank you for actually including this information part to this discussion, because I feel that conferences that focus in general on disinformation tend to switch to different topics than social disinformation, and it's very important to talk about this in context. So when you want to answer the question why we believe into disinformation, why it spreads so fast, we need to understand a few different levels. And first, we need to look at ourselves, because we all follow some cognitive biases, and we all tend to be influenced by them. Whether we want to believe more our family or friends, or whether we want to not double-check information that we all already want to believe that are true, right? This is how internet bubbles, social media bubbles are being created, because we tend to follow information we agree with. But that's just the first step, right? Disinformation in the context of this conference can be a tool to weaponize homophobia, transphobia as well. because it builds upon pre-existing prejudice and stereotypes in the society. It just uses them. And of course, on top of that, that groups would want to switch the national messages. You have, obviously, political agenda, whether it's internal or external. And that's very true that a lot of disinformation that focus on LGBTQI people originated in Russia and is forced by Russia to European Union to undermine our values, to present European as a rotten West that has no moral values and do not follow these traditional religious paths. That's one goal of disinformation, but also we have internal disinformation that is being localized, contextualized to the specific societies, specific countries. With those messages, you can build electoral power, you can have some more influence, you can spread your messages in more effective way. And different national groups in different countries are using disinformation also on LGBT people that originated in Russia for the national level. And how the disinformation can be localized, maybe I was thinking about the example and I thought about Istanbul Convention. So it entered into force in 2014, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. And I believe back then in 2015, 16, in Poland and even in Eastern Europe, we had some discussion. But maybe 2 years later, 2018, 17, 18, we had a spread of disinformation on gender ideology based on the Istanbul Convention. But now this topic does not exist in Poland. I mean, gender identity, disinformation based on this topic exists, but it's not connected to Istanbul Convention. And from recent studies, from this year's studies, I analyzed disinformation in Moldova as well, and there, now, currently, disinformation on Istanbul Convention is used because it is now good for politicians, but mostly influenced by Russia, to undermine European Union values this way because it's going to be effective because of the accession. So we have almost the same narrative that you can see in different countries in different moments, but they're going to be tailored to the local context by different groups. The localization also can be kind of perceived. So let's say we have Pride Month, right? We know, and a lot of people who work in disinformation are trying to prepare themselves that during the Pride Month, we will have increase in disinformation on LGBT people because it is a hot topic in disinformation that month. And when we speak about we said about prevention and countering narratives. This is also important in this context to think about pre-banking and preparing yourself to pre-detect disinformation narrative, prepare and spread positive, not even counter narratives, but positive narratives before those peaks that we can predict. Maybe that's gonna be more difficult to spread them. But another thing that makes disinformation so easy to go is to polarize, antagonize people against specific NGOs, ministers, right? Specific targeted laws, specific person, specific activists. That's a very effective mechanism. And what is also important to say in this aspect is that disinformation about LGBTQI people has a huge history. It is definitely longer than COVID, right? And I'm a huge fan of European Digital Media Observatory reports. I totally recommend those. And when you look at them, you can see that we have general trends like COVID, war, in the disinformation, right? And climate crisis, really important now. But month after month, in their reports, you will see that LGBTQI disinformation will be used. And it's constant, it's always there. This is why it's so easy to follow these messages, because we are never leaving this infosphere where this disinformation is present. So, yeah, maybe I will stop here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por el esfuerzo. Yo creo que a veces no se nos puede olvidar que hasta 1990 la homosexualidad estaba dentro de la Organización Mundial de la Salud como una enfermedad, y hasta el 2018 no se replanteó un poco lo que era la disforia de género, como lo queramos ahora nombrar, ¿no? Es decir, que ahí tenemos la losa de que hasta hace muy poquito éramos enfermos, éramos enfermas, y por tanto, bueno, pues esa desinformación también cala y moja sobre un terreno que ya hay que deconstruir, ¿no? y que es importante no perder de vista. En este segundo turno de respuestas, yo creo que es importante que si alguien quiere incorporar algo a la conversación que se ha dado, pues que se sienta con la libertad de poder hacerlo. Sí que vamos a reducir un pelín el tiempo a 3-4 minutos para que nos dé tiempo a terminar más o menos en hora, y sobre todo para que dé tiempo a, si se quiere formular alguna cuestión o alguna pregunta, pues también haya esa posibilidad, ¿no? Con lo cual, damos apertura a que podáis responder lo que yo os pregunto o incorporar algo a lo que ya se ha dicho, pero sí os pido que seamos más escuetitas en cuanto al tiempo. Claro, antes he hablado del 028, de la línea arcoíris, y bueno, para quienes no hemos estado esta mañana por aquí y para quienes yo creo que tienen interés, ¿no?, en saber qué es exactamente y qué función cumple este servicio, pues yo creo que es importante, ¿no?, saber qué vinculación tiene con los discursos de odio y qué es lo que se ha puesto en marcha exactamente desde el Ministerio de Igualdad.
Bueno, gracias Violeta de nuevo. La vinculación es tal que esta fue una idea que trabajamos en el Ministerio a raíz del asesinato de Samuel al grito de maricón, y pensando qué tipo de herramientas institucionales podían complementar y seguir impulsando la lucha contra la LGTBI-fobia, y particularmente cómo intentar proteger a las víctimas de la LGTBI-fobia, teniendo en cuenta que los datos son muy preocupantes, ¿no? Sabemos que, antes decía la secretaria de Estado, no es solo el disco que suena, sino dónde resuena. Sabemos que hay muchas situaciones que implican un mayor o menor grado de violencia LGTBI-fóbica en muchos contextos cotidianos de las personas LGTBI, en el colegio, en el trabajo, en la familia, en los espacios de ocio, que muchas de ellas incluso pueden ser no malintencionadas por parte de quien las ejerce, seguramente desde una posición en la que no pretende herir, porque parte de lo que consiste la LGTBI-fobia es en la normalización y en la naturalización de esas bromas, de ese estigma, de esa burla, ¿no?, que al final manda un mensaje claro, que es que esas vidas no valen lo mismo, no son igualmente legítimas, pero que parte de por lo que puede existir en la sociedad, cuando evidentemente en la sociedad hay muy pocas personas que, digamos, legitimen o justifiquen una agresión física por motivos LGTBI-fóbicos, mucho menos un asesinato, pero la normalización y la naturalización de expresiones que se pueden considerar menos graves, aunque en realidad son el caldo de cultivo también de las más graves, es una realidad que tenemos, ¿no? Entonces, hay una realidad de esos delitos de odio y de esas conductas LGTBI-fóbicas que tiene que ver con su naturalización, y por tanto también que muchas veces las víctimas lo normalizan y dicen, oye, esto me lleva pasando toda la vida, o total no es para tanto, o paso de meterme en un lío burocrático porque ni siquiera somos capaces las instituciones de hacer conocer al conjunto de la comunidad LGTBI, el conjunto de la ciudadanía, los derechos que asisten a las personas LGTBI, ¿no? Y que en realidad lo que te está pasando es violencia, lo que te está pasando es discriminación, lo que te está pasando es algo que no debería ocurrir en la sociedad, y la institución tiene la obligación de protegerte. Entonces, en lo concreto, esa línea 028 pretende esto, ser un servicio de atención integral para cualquier persona que sufra una situación de violencia LGTBI-fóbica, entendiendo que esos discursos y delitos de odio tienen digamos, están tan naturalizados que hay muchas personas que pueden sufrir esa violencia y no saber qué hacer y que necesiten sentir que hay instituciones que son lugares seguros donde les pueden informar de cuáles son sus derechos y acompañarles también emocionalmente en esos momentos y, por tanto, que es obligación del Estado dar protección y garantizar los derechos de las personas víctimas. Por eso es un servicio que va a atender 24 horas al día en todo el territorio. Ya hay ejemplos en algunos territorios de nuestro país en los que este tipo de servicios se estaba prestando y, por supuesto, lo haremos en coordinación con otras administraciones como son las comunidades autónomas, ¿no? Yo creo que más allá del elemento concreto, de la acción concreta, es importante entender que llega en un momento en el que los delitos de odio siguen creciendo también. Hoy mismo el Ministerio del Interior publicaba los datos relativos al 2022 y se mantiene la tendencia en España de crecimiento de los delitos de odio hacia la población LGTBI, particularmente a las personas trans. En España el mayor número de delitos de odio es contra personas racializadas, pero los que más crecen proporcionalmente son los delitos contra la población LGTBI. Eso pasaba ya en los datos que teníamos hasta ahora, pero hoy el Ministerio del Interior publica los datos que confirman esa tendencia y, por tanto, este tipo de servicios son, yo creo, más importantes que nunca, como digo, en lo concreto, porque hay muchas personas que pueden necesitar conocer cuáles son sus derechos, saber que las instituciones son lugares seguros, pero, y por tanto, recurrir a ello para poder acceder a sus derechos, en un contexto además de alta infradenuncia de esos delitos y de esas actuaciones LGTBI-fóbicas, pero también que lanza un mensaje al conjunto de la sociedad, y es que las vidas de las personas LGTBI importan, que vuestras vidas, sus vidas, todas las vidas importan y, por tanto, que las instituciones son lugares seguros. Y eso en un contexto en el que también la LGTBI-fobia se reproduce desde las instituciones, cuando esto no debería ocurrir porque, como decía antes, los representantes públicos, todos tenemos la obligación de cumplir y hacer cumplir los derechos humanos, pero si aún así eso está ocurriendo, tienen que saber que las instituciones son lugares seguros a los que pueden acudir para defender sus derechos y, sobre todo, que detrás de ello lo que hay es que sus vidas tienen sentido, merecen la pena, son tan legítimas como cualquier otra y que no están solas.
Muchas gracias, ministra, por la medida y por el trabajo que se hace desde igualdad para los derechos LGTBI y para los derechos de las mujeres. A la ministra de Países Bajos me gustaría preguntarle, ¿no?, cómo se considera que es la forma más efectiva para fortalecer a las organizaciones LGTBIQ para combatir, ¿no?, todos estos discursos de odio y cómo se puede hacer para que reciban apoyo institucional, ¿no?, el apoyo institucional cuando otras no lo reciben.
Thank you very much. This is an interesting question, I think, because we are convinced, and I would like to stress how important partnerships with non-governmental organizations are, because they can provide local knowledge, they can create local impact, and above all, provide a safe haven for those who face difficulties because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So in our opinion, NGOs are a crucial motor of change of the position of LGBTIQ+ persons in our societies, and that's why we always apply to the principle nothing about them without them, and always consult local civil society before taking action. Well, I think that it is important that we, and that's what we do in the Netherlands, act as matchmakers and also provide financial support. For example, because of the dire situation, our government also recently decided to make more financial resources available for women's rights and equal rights for LGBTIQ+ people in Central and Eastern Europe and the Southern Caucasus. And we also decided to continue our financial support to European umbrella organizations like TGU, ILGA Europe and ICLIO for at least the next 3 years. What I would like to put on the table is that we realize that we, as the Netherlands, are the largest government donor to those NGOs in the world. What I would like to appeal to my fellow member states, if they would like to think about it, well, could give some support to the mentioned EU umbrella organizations, because we think, as I said before, we don't act in a vacuum, not in Europe. We act worldwide, and we need to support those actions worldwide. So let's together support those impactful actions of the NGOs. And well, let's finish with the words I used this morning. Working on this path of equality, we have to do everything we can, because this is a task for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. El papel de las organizaciones es fundamental y también en ocasiones para ese papel hace falta pues códigos, protocolos, ¿no? Actuaciones, procedimientos. En ese sentido, el Código de Conducta para contrarrestar el discurso de odio legal online, ilegal online, ¿no? que se aprobó hace 7 años, yo creo que juega un papel clave, ¿no? Y lo que quizás necesitaríamos es como saber cómo funciona y cómo valora la Comisión Europea el impacto, ¿no? de este código para reducir el discurso de odio hacia las personas LGBTI.
So for the first, maybe just to reiterate that several speakers in the table, so they have already mentioned so how important the illegal hate speech is and how increasing new phenomenon it is also with the new media. And therefore, so even prior to the adoption of our LGBTIQ equality strategy, already you mentioned it, so in 2016, so we have started to work with the key IT platforms on the voluntary basis. This is the code of practice, code of conduct, so that you have mentioned that in practice actually is looking for engagement on the voluntary basis with the key platforms. So now we have 9 platforms. We started with Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Microsoft. And now, so we have engaged already in the meantime, so Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Viber, and Twitch. On the voluntary basis, these platforms, they are actually doing in the margin of the code of conduct 2 things. So they are engaging in noticing and also action mechanism, because they first try to review, and if necessary, because it is illegal hate speech, according also the national legislation when transposing the framework decision that I've been speaking about in the previous, answering the previous question. So they are taking down this illegal content. And it is working rather well, but of course it is based on this national law which is transposing the framework decision. The second aspect is engaging civil society, because there are those cooperative platforms where the multi-stakeholders organizations are working together in order to address those challenging and developing societal challenges through the different ways of addressing them. And many of you also mentioned that this backslash and also anti-gender narrative. So that this is precisely the platform which is working jointly on the way, so how to address them and eventually build up on the counter-narrative. Now, since 2016, so we as a Commission, so we are engaged in the monitoring of the action, mostly of the platforms. Of course, we are supporting this platform as well. And I have to say it has been rather successful, because the percentage of the removal from 2016 was around less than 30%, so now we are around 60%. So it has been really a very solid improvement. However, as some of the speakers mentioned already, unfortunately the hate speech against the LGBTIQ people is the 3rd most spread one. So therefore, so we have taken also based on this experience and action. And we have adopted very recently the new Digital Service Act in 2022, end of the year entered already in force, which is actually pushing those agreed mechanisms at the voluntary basis on the legally binding base. Now, so all the big platforms, which has a turnout of more than 450 million per month, so they are now obliged, legally binded. It is already in force, and from February next year it will be punishable. So that means that they have to turn down illegal hate speech, hate crime, and they have to cooperate, there is also much easier access to complain, to have information, to understand how the platforms are actually operating. And there is also very important trust access of the fact-checkers who can cooperate with the platforms in order to make sure that illegal hate speech is detected, removed, and eventually also there are sanctions following these things. Having said that, let me only reiterate what Commissioner Dalli said in her previous speech, that we are now alongside of the middle of our LGBTIQ strategy. You know that one of the key components of it is precisely safety of the LGBTIQ people. We are working very closely with the member states, also in the margin of the high-level group on combating hate speech and hate crime since 2016, and also since 2021, so in the margin of our LGBTIQ subgroup. And it is very important to use this midterm review of the strategy, also gathering new ideas, see where are the gaps in implementation of the strategy, and to see how more effectively, together with the member states and now key partners from the civil society, so we can fight illegal hate speech even in a more efficient way.
Gracias. Justo en relación al código y a todas las medidas que se ponen desde la Comisión Europea, quería preguntarle a Auge Sangil, ¿no?, en qué consiste el papel de Trusted Flagger que desde la LGTBIQ+ se está desempeñando.
Bueno, llevamos desde el año 2016 participando en las rondas de evaluación del código de conducta, ¿no?, con el objetivo es prevenir y contrarrestar la propagación del discurso de odio. Y desde su firma, como ha dicho, creo que cada vez es una herramienta cada vez más importante, ¿no?, en la que hay que participar y donde se han forjado una cooperación estrecha entre las principales partes interesadas en la lucha contra la incitación al odio del colectivo. Como Trusted Flyer o comunicable, fiable, ¿no?, que somos, el rol de la Federación es el de estar vigilante ante los discursos de odio que se generan en las redes sociales. Sobre todo, fundamentalmente por motivos de LGTBI-fobia. Y a través de este papel que se le ha otorgado a la Federación, tenemos la capacidad de advertir a las plataformas sociales cuando un contenido podría ser considerado un discurso de odio, y a su vez las plataformas sociales entienden que un contenido denunciado por un Trusted Flyer es prioritario, por lo que es considerado con mayor rapidez para su eliminación. En definitiva, los Trusted Flyers o los comunicantes fiables son organizaciones especializadas en las que las plataformas de las redes pueden apoyarse para identificar los discursos de odio de una forma más clara, más rápida, más directa. Y en cuanto a la evolución de estos 7 años de monitoreo, se observa que cada vez más las entidades logramos reportar más contenido y que en términos generales la revisión en menos de 24 horas por parte de las compañías es mayor. Por ejemplo, en el último ejercicio realizado en el año 2022, la tasa media de eliminación fue del 63,6%, más o menos similar a la de 2021, un 62,5%. Pero si nos fijamos en el rendimiento individual de las plataformas, la mayoría de ellas, excepto YouTube, no aumentan el número de eliminación de contenidos de incitación al odio. Aunque sí podríamos decir que la calidad de la respuesta a las notificaciones a los usuarios sí va mejorando en estos años. Solo 3 datos. En el último monitoreo se ha hecho una evaluación desde el año 2016 que comenzamos hasta 2022. Resaltaba antes YouTube, donde sí que ha aumentado de un 45% en 2016 a un 90% de eliminación en 2022. Pero hay un dato curioso con TikTok. que comienza su monitorización en el 2021, donde hay una eliminación del 80% y en 2022 del 60,1%. O sea que baja. Twitter, 2016, un 19%, pero en 2021 sube a un 49% y ahora vuelve a bajar su eliminación en un 45%. Y la tendencia es a la baja, que aunque ha habido años donde se ha impulsado mucho la eliminación de estos discursos de odio en la red, ahora vuelven a bajar esa intensidad por parte de las plataformas. Por lo tanto, hay que volver a insistir y seguir trabajando en ello. Pero bueno, creo que es una buena venida y la alianza de tantas plataformas como Trusted Flyer, pues al final funciona y tenemos que seguir ahí.
Muchas gracias, Uge. A Ikram, yo le quería preguntar por la I. Que más allá del ámbito sanitario, ¿no? Siempre bueno, pues existe un poco la incógnita, ¿no? de no conocer mucho las violencias que sufren las personas, ¿no? intersexuales, intersex. ¿Existe un discurso de odio específicamente dirigido a las personas intersexuales, un discurso de odio interfóbico? Y si es así, ¿en qué consiste y cómo lo estáis combatiendo desde ILGA?
Thank you very much for the question, and I would like to start from just pointing out that maybe for the future such conferences that there's the organization Intersex International and European branch of it, OIA Europe, and it would be good that if this question would be addressed to them as they specifically working on the rights of intersex people. But I will try to cover because we do work with OIA Europe. So the first message is that as we see from the FRA survey reports, that intersex people are victims of both hate speech and hate crimes. And for example, online hate speech also quite prevalent. For example, 28% of the victims of hate speech, they received emails with the threatening message or derogatory terms used against them, or they were also left comments on social media as well. And 27% of intersex people also experience at least once hate speech, which is also, I think, quite a good number. But if you look, also ILGA Europe did intersectional analysis, and if you look at those numbers, when intersex people with disabilities, intersex people from the ethnic minorities, including the migrant background, or other with multiple identities, then these numbers usually go double at least, or go higher. So OIA Europe also did study in 2019 about also hate speech, how hate speech manifests against intersex people, and this is mostly related with the variation of their sex characteristics. And online hate speech manifests in 6 different ways. They were identified, OIA Europe identified. It's talking about intersex people as anomalies to eliminate. That's a first kind of rhetoric. Second rhetoric is the denial of intersex people's existence at all. So there are not such intersex people. And then third is exclusion of intersex from the discourse of the human sex. So there's only binary sex, as we know, and that's also excludes intersex. And fourth one is the fake information from so-called fake experts. They call themselves experts on intersex, and they usually highly medicalized. They use the highly medicalized discourse, denying the agency to the intersex people themselves. Five Sisters, it's a defense of the mutilations. As we know, intersex people often in infancy or later on, they go through the intersex genital mutilation so that they could fit into so-called binary biological genders. And the last one is also fetishism. So they use language fetishizing intersex people. And my message would be that how to mitigate this is very first one, just awareness, raising awareness of yourself at the national level, just reaching out, and if you know existence of intersex activists or intersex organizations, start inviting them to have a conversation, ask them what are their main concerns and what would be the agenda and how you can support. And yeah, inviting to the high-level events, it would be also a good start. And also providing legal provisions, because both at the national and EU levels, there is very few. For example, from last year, there was only 4 member states from EU members who provided protection specifically from hate speech based on sex characteristics, which means that 23 countries still have no legal protection for the intersex people from the hate speech and hate crime. And then also, so explicit mention of the sex characteristics. And I think it's, as a Swedish presidency, I think you could also often times at the EU level, treaty is being kind of used so that sexual orientation only and sex characteristics is not part of it. But I think there should be conversation depending on the, first of all, history, the time when the treaty was adopted. There was no visibility of trans people, intersex people, and it should be taken into account. And also discussing also with the legal services on the how to broaden the, this protection on the grounds to the gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, considering the also case law. So these are the main messages. But yeah, main thing is that please do engage with intersex activists and organizations and talk with them. Yeah, that's my main point. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ekram. Completamente de acuerdo, ¿no?, con la interactuación de las organizaciones de activistas. Recuerdo un curso de verano el año pasado que ofreció el Ministerio de Igualdad en los cursos de verano que tenemos aquí en la Universidad de Layo, que se celebran en Santander, como justo las representantes de las organizaciones intersex ofrecieron un discurso que nos dejaron a todas las personas que estábamos en esos cursos completamente descolocadas, porque es una realidad muy desconocida y que cuando la escuchas por parte de las propias titulares de derechos te das cuenta hasta qué punto hay un grado de discriminación, de invisibilización y de violencia que se está ejerciendo cotidianamente, ¿no? Otro de los colectivos, otro de los grupos, ¿no?, que desde ahí sufren esa violencia discursiva en muchas ocasiones, pero no solo, son las personas no binarias, ¿no? En ese sentido, a Francesca Sanders me gustaría preguntarle sobre la invisibilización que sufrimos las personas no binarias, pero que de otras formas también puede manifestarse esa violencia, ¿no?, esa discriminación. Desde Transgender Europe, ¿no?, pues qué buenas prácticas venís identificando para combatirlas.
Yes, thanks for the question. And you're absolutely right that non-binary people are invisible in society, in precisely in the way that, for example, trans women of color are very visible, and this is exactly what can attract violence towards them. Non-binary people, on the other hand, are very little understood and not accommodated for in society. And this is really significant considering that the FRA 2019 LGBTIQ survey showed that 50% of the trans and non-binary respondents were in fact non-binary. So this is a huge and by some estimates growing share of the trans community. And to start with maybe a brief definition to say that we use the term non-binary to refer to, as an umbrella term, to refer to a whole lot of different identities that fall outside the gender binary. So for those people who don't identify as male or female, or a man or a woman. They can be people who identify as both, as neither. Some people use terms like agender, as gender queer, gender fluid, as two-spirit, as bigender, polygender. There's a whole lot of different ways to identify, plus many, many more. And so we use this term non-binary as sort of an umbrella term, but different people are going to use this in a personal way. TGU and ILGA Europe did a data extraction from the FRA survey from 2019, and one of the things that we found out was that a huge majority, so 96% of the non-binary respondents, had not obtained legal gender recognition or accessed trans-Pacific healthcare, and also that non-binary people are the least open about their gender identity compared with binary trans people. So while society and different societies are starting to understand trans people in general, especially binary trans people, non-binary people are much less understood, let alone catered for in policy and legal frameworks. And even when they are accepted in legal frameworks or where there is possibility to access legal gender recognition, without broader acceptance in other parts of society, these sort of mechanisms actually have very little meaning. And what we've also heard is that some people who are able to access these third gender marker options or no gender marker option can even receive rather a further scrutiny because authorities are not familiar with what this means, and then this can also attract attention. So I'd like to, from there, introduce a few moments in a non-binary person's day or an experience where they are going to come across times when their identity is not considered valid or there is no acceptance of their identity. For example, gendered spaces at work or in public spaces where there are binary gendered bathrooms, gendered uniforms, gendered shelters, gendered public spaces like swimming pools, misgendering when you want to book, for example, a flight or a train ticket. You can have an X gender marker or you can have a non-binary gender marker in your passport, but then if you want to buy a flight ticket, there is very often not the option to choose any other option besides a binary gender option. Non-binary people experience discriminatory attitudes and mistreatment from people who don't understand their presentation, their gender expression, and also their identity. They might experience, as do other binary trans people, mismatching identity, graduation certificates, identity documents that don't match their identity, which then have to be explained, which can then cause extreme frustration and violence, unfortunately, as well as difficulties accessing healthcare. Many non-binary people are simply not recognized in the healthcare system, which is a huge area that needs to be rectified. But there are things that can be done. So first, looking at legal gender recognition, so official recognition of non-binary gender identities. There are countries that are introducing non-binary options. Germany has a non-binary gender marker option. Malta and Denmark do, although at the moment they don't extend to the birth register, but I do understand that Malta is working to change this. Malta also is the only EU country that has non-binary parenthood recognition, which is excellent. And also in Malta, non-binary refugees are able to change their documents to reflect their identity. But then if an asylum seeker is rejected for their claims for asylum and sent back to their home country, this identity can then cause issues because in their home country this may not be recognized. Iceland, not in the EU, but Iceland has a really good example of a non-binary gender marker as well as parenthood option on the birth certificate. And also just thinking about the way that we communicate with each other, practicing using gender-neutral language. In English, we can use they, them as pronouns that actually work very well. It's grammatically correct. Different people prefer different things, and you can also practice not referring to any person using he or she, but just talking about a person. We can talk about our colleague. I mean, in English, it's very easy, and I understand that this is not the case in all languages. So English gives us a lot more options, but I think that it's also, we're practicing this in a lot of spaces. In addition to that, we need to work harder at providing social accommodation. Government actors, civil society organizations, and I mean that also for us, We need to work harder at understanding the needs of the non-binary community and recognizing that they are, in many ways, unique and different from the binary trans community. And then finally, maybe just to echo what has been said before about hate speech, I think that what we can also work on, and this is kind of connected to what's happening with non-binary community, but to resist the anti-gender rhetoric and to counter the disinformation about trans and non-binary people. Thanks.
Muchísimas gracias, Francesca, por darnos esta información y tratar de condensarla, que sé que es complicado, ¿no? Me parece muy importante, para ir ya concluyendo estas dos palabras que nos quedan, Sofía, que nos pudieras como hablar de las alianzas y las coaliciones que en este escenario se pueden dar entre la sociedad civil, ¿no? Las organizaciones de mujeres, las organizaciones LGBTIQ+, desde Naciones Unidas, ¿cómo veis, ¿no? esas opciones y esas posibilidades?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and be very quick. I've slashed a lot of what I was going to say. So yes, obviously cross-issue alliances have never been more critical in the context of what we've been discussing today. But in addition to the external forces that we've been highlighting and that I was breaking down before, we also have to contend with, in order to move forward, the dynamics within and around our own movements, and those who should be allied, I'm referring to. So I just want to make 3 quick points with regard to that, and I'm sorry if it seems a bit obvious to some people. First of all, LGBTIQ+ communities, plural, are not monolithic, but have nuanced and diverse needs and demands, especially where this intersects with other characteristics I won't elaborate, as others already have. Secondly, transphobia and lesbophobia are both rife in and around our movements, and this contributes to the pushback. We also need to continue addressing the relative erasure of intersex realities, non-binary, bisexual, asexual realities everywhere. And I see that in my work globally, that's an issue. And then also particularly concerning for me in my role at the UN is the hysteria about gender diversity that is being evoked within some women's rights spaces. And to those who are contributing to that, I want them to understand 3 broad things, which again might be a little bit obvious to some of us here, but I think it's important to highlight that gendered hate speech is a form of gender-based violence, and it stems from and it reinforces gender-based discrimination, and it can directly lead to hate crimes. Secondly, there's a positive correlation between gendered hate speech and surges in gender-based violence against gender-diverse people, sorry for the translators, worldwide. And this is strongly linked with violent extremism, and we have examples of that from across regions. So it's important to understand that the words from within our own movements can exacerbate these trends in particularly toxic ways. Nonetheless, there are many existing alliances that are strengthening, and there are new ones that are forming. These are really forming as broader, more networked movements for social change. Of course, this is not a new idea. There's a long history of allied activism, and it's particularly interesting and effective where it cuts across race and class and gender, amongst other factors. And this has demonstrated time and again across regions effective approaches to addressing common concerns. And I'm not just talking about common in terms of our own rights, but also concerns like climate change that we're seeing allied activism from. And it's also proven to be particularly effective in withstanding backlash. So looking forward, just quickly, first of all, none of this can actually be done properly without the funding and capacity needed to sustain our movements. And that continues to be a chronic concern across the world about or actually LGBTIQ plus funding on the whole is less than all of foundation and government funding, and then only 5% of that 1% is distributed directly to LBQ issues and communities. And then if you look at Asia in particular the region that I live in, the data is particularly shocking, and then in Central Asia it's even worse. So just to sort of finish, more than rhetorical solidarity, I think that we must all in our various roles work towards more proactive and mutual solidarity, and by that I mean overtly promoting and adopting one another's goals and priorities and principles of intersectional queer feminist justice, and take localised approaches led by local activists and communities, and that includes things like respecting when visibility is not going to be constructive and it might add to danger, for example. So it's a call on women's advocates to embrace their queer foundations, because they are there always, and respond to the urgency of the threats that we're seeing. It's a call on LGBTIQ plus advocates to treat women's rights issues as intrinsically linked to our own, and also take ownership of gender equality agendas as our own. To governments, I encourage governments to keep going beyond a focus on individual behaviours to more structural approaches around that seek to focus on the systemic condoning of hate speech. Lastly, of course, UN Women has its own unique and important role in all of this, in responding to this combined pushback and to using its own platforms to really assert the centrality of LGBTIQ plus human rights to broader gender equality work. I'm happy to discuss what we're doing later on with anyone.
Muchísimas gracias por la respuesta. Ya para cerrar, Magdalena, y Polonia es un país al que miramos en muchas ocasiones porque se ha convertido en un referente negativo, por así decirlo, respecto a la oposición a los derechos de las personas LGBTI, ¿no? Todas las zonas libres de personas LGTBI, ¿no? Y muchas otras políticas que también afectan a las mujeres, por supuesto que sí, y a los derechos sexuales y reproductivos de las mujeres, están ahí y realmente quizá lo que nos falta saber es cómo se ha llegado a esa situación y qué lecciones tenemos que aprender de lo sucedido, y también cuál es un poco la lección que desde Polonia las propias personas, ¿no?, del país venís aprendiendo.
Thank you for this question. I just want to address one thing. I am super thrilled, and it's awesome that trusted flaggers mechanism is going to enter into force under the DSA. I just worry that decision and appointment procedure for the NGOs who's going to be a trusted flaggers is up to national coordinator, and that we don't know whether this procedure is going to be transparent. And yeah, I think it's going to be very different in different countries. And yeah, that's just something I worry about. And yeah, I want to tell you a story, answering a question, a story of year 2018 in Poland, and a specific narrative that was used back then. So LGBT community early in February celebrated signing of equality declaration by the mayor of Warsaw. It was a huge success. They fought for that like for years. And just after this, because the mayor of Warsaw is in the opposition to the government, and it was an election year, we saw a rise of very specific narrative. Firstly, it targeted sexual education, and WHO, before the pandemic, very trend-setting, that the declaration and such policies, also European Union policies, which would follow WHO standards, would force teachers to teach kids masturbation in general. So that's just a shortcut, but in general, that LGBT community is responsible for potentially endangering kids and sexualizing them. Just a month later, we saw a statement by a very important Polish politician who stated during the election event, leave our children alone. It was a bit more hostile, but it wasn't hate speech. And then the narrative started to change, and it was slowly being dehumanized, going the way to dehumanize LGBTQA people, stating that they are not people, it's an ideology. And then this narrative was pushed by months. We saw in public media videos where LGBT people would be connected to pedophilia. Obviously, that's a very common conspiracy theory. We saw a very hostile messages. And if in some channels, obviously, media and social media channels, and if a person would follow only those channels, they would worry that the kids are in danger. And later on, it was June, Pride Month, we had Pride events. We saw clashes of people, and those were not Russian trolls who kicked or pulled hair of activists and people in the parade. Those were ordinary citizens that were truly worried about kids' traditional values. Later on, we had parades where a couple brought a homemade bomb that was stopped by the police, the couple, to the Pride event, and that could potentially kill 2 to 5 people. And they actually spent time at home to make the bomb. And later on, we had attacks on the activist offices. And later on, we had elections. And when I spoke with activists, they told me that their focus now, it's not about fighting LGBT-free zones. I will share a bit more about that now. They're focusing now, after how this narrative grows and grows and grows, they're focusing on suicide prevention, prevention of homelessness. This is not a discussion about equality of marriage. So as to these LGBT-free zones, so those are a declaration made by state districts, local authorities. There are not really no-go zones or something like that. Those are just declarations, right? But almost 100 districts signed those, city council, etc. And we fought them in courts. And still almost half of them, I believe, are in force, but the rest were either withdrawn or challenged before courts. And yeah, public administrative courts actually stated that these are discriminatory. So yeah, and we also had the European Union countering those. So the LGBT-free zones that actually gathered a lot of attention was just like the last aspect, right? It was the most common international, like the most present internationally, but before that we had a lot of different narratives, and they were formulated very specifically for a specific message. Yeah. And lesson learned, yeah, I don't know, maybe don't do that, but lesson learned is to actually, I believe that to fund and ensure independence of public media. That would be one solution. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, estamos muy justas de tiempo, con lo cual vamos a cerrar el panel. El desafío que tenemos es enorme. yo quiero agradeceros la concisión del tiempo a la hora de vuestras exposiciones, pero sí que quiero trasladaros el agradecimiento, pero sobre todo la confianza de que las instituciones a las que representáis sigan existiendo con representantes que crean en los derechos humanos y en los derechos de las personas LGTBI, ¿no? Porque el riesgo efectivamente es que las instituciones las ocupen otras personas que no creen en los derechos LGBTI y que las obligaciones de los Estados miembros y las normativas bueno, pues queden de alguna manera en papel mojado o haya que volver a reconquistarlas, ¿no? El desafío es enorme, el apoyo por parte de quienes formamos parte de los colectivos es total y efectivamente es momento de alianzas, de compromiso y ojalá esta presidencia europea y este tipo de encuentros que están tan a alto nivel bueno, pues permeen en las políticas y en las medidas para que las personas que al fin y al cabo son las ciudadanas y ciudadanos que nos beneficiamos de estas medidas podamos comprender la importancia de que estéis vosotras y vosotros, vosotres en las instituciones. Solamente comprendiendo la importancia de que nuestros representantes crean en los derechos humanos podremos también defender la democracia. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muy brevemente, buenas tardes ya, secretarios y secretarias de Estado, autoridades. Buenas tardes y muchísimas gracias por haber acudido a este evento de la Presidencia Española de la Unión Europea, que, como saben, hemos titulado Avanzando en Derechos LGTBIQ en Europa. Ya ha llegado el momento de decir, del final, de decir hasta aquí por hoy. Gracias también a todas las personas que nos habéis acompañado desde la sociedad civil y desde el activismo LGTBI, que, como antes decíamos, salva vidas y hace vidas felices y, por supuesto, es el motor fundamental de los avances en derechos. Creo que la representación que hoy hemos tenido en este evento es la garantía de lo mejor que tiene Europa para fortalecer la democracia y para defender la libertad. Y por eso terminamos esta jornada, creo, con algunos mensajes claros. El primero, que la lucha por los derechos LGTBI es una obligación si queremos fortalecer la democracia, que precisamente por ello, con todas las décadas de lucha que nos preceden, por todos los cientos, miles de personas que han puesto el cuerpo para defender los derechos de los que hoy debatíamos y que hoy conquistamos, lo cierto es que esto no ha hecho más que empezar. Es decir, que todavía tenemos un largo camino por recorrer y que nunca más va a haber países, al menos ese es el compromiso que hoy asumimos, sin las personas LGTBI y sin sus derechos garantizados. Los derechos LGTBI son derechos humanos, creo que ese ha sido un gran consenso de esta jornada que en estos tiempos es necesario remarcar, y Europa debe ser un lugar seguro para todas las personas LGTBI con dos objetivos prioritarios, como son el avance en derechos y combatir de forma decidida los discursos de odio. Celebro que hayamos conseguido suscribir esa declaración en la que invitamos a la Comisión Europea, entre otros asuntos, a que en 2025 adoptemos una nueva estrategia de igualdad LGTBI que continúe el trabajo de la primera estrategia que está en vigor ahora, o seguir cooperando con los Estados miembros, especialmente a través del subgrupo de igualdad LGTBIQ del Grupo de Alto Nivel de la Unión Europea sobre no discriminación, igualdad y diversidad, para facilitar el diálogo, compartir datos y también compartir buenas prácticas que nos permitan avanzar en derechos y también hacer efectivos los derechos que reconocemos en nuestros marcos normativos. Esta declaración también recoge los llamamientos para cada uno de los Estados miembros, como adoptar estrategias nacionales para erradicar la discriminación de las personas LGTBI o prohibir las llamadas prácticas o terapias de conversión. Es un orgullo para mí, para el equipo del Ministerio de Igualdad, para el Gobierno de España, saber que ya hemos materializado algunos de esos compromisos en la Ley 4/2023, en la Ley Trans y de Derechos LGTBI, pero sin duda es necesario que estos compromisos lleguen a todos y cada uno de los Estados miembros hasta que los derechos LGTBI sean una realidad en cada rincón de Europa y que todos los países sigamos pensando en lo que nos queda por hacer. Insisto, no solo en lo que tiene que ver con ampliar y fortalecer nuestros marcos normativos, sino en hacer efectivos todos los derechos para todas las personas de la comunidad LGTBI. Creo que hoy hemos escuchado muchos testimonios de lo conquistado y de lo que queda por conquistar. No me cabe duda, tras esta jornada, tras estos días y también tras todos estos años, de que tenemos muchos motivos para sentirnos orgullosas, que de hecho el orgullo es el corazón de nuestra democracia y representa también la mejor derrota del odio. Quisiera terminar invitando a todas las presentes a que sigamos tejiendo ese legado arcoíris de derechos que atraviese fronteras y realidades, que recojamos el legado de las que han venido antes, de las que han puesto el cuerpo, la vida también, y que lo transmitamos sin miedo a quienes vendrán después. El odio y la intolerancia pueden tener las patas muy cortas si no callamos y si transmitimos ese aprendizaje, esa lucha y esos derechos a todas las generaciones que vienen y también a nuestros vecinos y vecinas. Frente a esa vecindad arcoíris, este legado de derechos y democracia, insisto, el miedo y el odio y la intolerancia pueden tener las patas muy cortas. Así que sigamos protegiendo lo mejor que tiene Europa. Continuemos trabajando conjuntamente en la senda de los derechos LGTBI, porque, como les decía, esto no ha hecho más que empezar, y porque estamos convencidas de que ampliar derechos para toda la ciudadanía fortalece nuestras democracias. Esperamos hoy y siempre encontrarnos muchas veces en este camino. Le doy, para finalizar y clausurar definitivamente esta jornada, la palabra a Mary Colin Leroy, es la secretaria de Estado para la Igualdad de Oportunidades, Igualdad de Género y Diversidad de Bélgica. Como saben, es el país con el que compartimos trío de presidencia, ostentará la presidencia de la Unión después de España. Tienen un firme compromiso con la igualdad y está siendo un placer trabajar con todas ustedes en estos años de legislatura y ahora en el trío de presidencias, y tenemos una agenda compartida en la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres y también de las personas LGTBI en la agenda feminista. Así que suya es la palabra, the floor is yours, y muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Gracias.
Thank you. What a day. This will definitely be food for the mind for our effort in ending LGBTQI+ phobia and making Europe a real LGBTQI+ friendly union. Recuerdo la voluntad común de luchar por avanzando de los derechos a través del desarrollo del conocimiento sobre la situación de las personas intersexuales, sobre los avances para asegurarse de no volver atrás. Conocer mejor para deconstruir las representaciones clásicas. Decir mejor para hacerlo mejor es para mí muy importante. Es una responsabilidad pública, política, y aquí nosotros además tenemos la voluntad. I noted also specifically importance to inspire and share policy and legislation between member states. This is also why I strongly support the EU LGBTQI+ strategy. This legislature has shown us what can be done when we have a commissioner with an equality portfolio. We see also how important it is to continue to speak out for the LGBTQI community in the Council and to have a dedicated space to monitor the implementation of the EU strategy. Because all Europeans have every right to be who they want to be, to love who they want to love, and to live how they want to live. I would also like to use the opportunity to invite you already for the Belgium high-level event on the 17th of May 2024. I hope we will all celebrate together Hideout Day in Brussels. What is more, we are organizing this conference in conjunction with the Hideout Forum of the Council of Europe that will take place in The Hague. Thank you for our excellent collaboration with the Dutch government. With the hope of advancing together, I thank the Spanish presidency, all the organizers and speakers for an excellent day of exchange and inspiration. Thank you very much.
Para finalizar la jornada, en unos minutos dará comienzo la representación de la obra teatral Yo soy el que soy, de Harold Lee. Se trata de la versión reducida de una obra autobiográfica en la que el autor, famoso violinista...